For the first time in Burkina Faso's history, an entire brigade of soldiers has traded rifles for plows. 8,000 men, once trained for defense, now march toward the nation's farmlands. To the outside world, this looks like desperation. To Ibrahim Traoré, it is discipline redirected. The order was simple: secure the harvest before the next crisis begins. No one expected a military decree about seeds. Yet in a country where every drought can feel like an invasion, Traoré's move has stunned both allies and rivals. Across Ouagadougou, people woke up to the sound of engines, not tanks, but tractors escorted by soldiers. Their mission? Reclaim abandoned land, irrigate dry zones, and feed the republic from within. Some Western analysts call it an act of panic. Others whisper it is a preparation for sanctions. But for many Africans watching from across the Sahel, it feels like something else entirely: a declaration of economic independence. When a leader turns his army into farmers, it means he no longer waits for aid convoys. He builds his own convoy of grain. The numbers are striking: 8,000 troops reassigned, 50 cooperatives created, over 100,000 hectares marked for immediate planting. The same logistics that once moved artillery now move irrigation pipes, fertilizers, and field drones. Every hectare secured is one less day dependent on foreign import. If you listen closely to Traoré's recent speech, there was no trace of hesitation. The next war, he said, will be fought not for gold or oil, but for food. Those words now echo across Africa's corridors of power. Is this the birth of a new agricultural doctrine, or the quiet beginning of an economic war? If this story matters for Africa's future, stay with me. Because what Burkina Faso is building today could redefine how nations defend themselves, without firing a single shot. When President Ibrahim Traoré signed the decree known as Operation Harvest, few outside his circle understood its full scope. It was not a public relations gesture or a temporary work program. It was a structural shift, one that redefined what national security meant in a country repeatedly tested by drought, sanctions, and insurgency. The document ordered 8,000 active soldiers to be reassigned to agricultural service under the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Agriculture. Their task? To transform fallow military lands and neglected rural zones into high-yield production sites within 6 months. At first, international observers dismissed it as an act of improvisation. Western commentators called it agrarian populism, predicting that soldiers would abandon the fields within weeks. But on the ground, something different was happening. Convoys of military trucks carried irrigation equipment instead of weapons. Commanders trained in logistics began organizing seed distribution. Engineering units used combat drones to survey soil humidity and map river flows. By the third week, the army had cleared more than 15,000 hectares of land, enough to feed 500,000 people for a year. In Koudougou, a sergeant named Moussa Zerbo, once assigned to counter-terror patrols, now leads a 40-man cooperative. His team plants maize at dawn, guards the fields by night, and reports progress every evening to the regional command center. When asked if he misses the front line, he answers quietly, "This is still the front line." Hunger is the enemy now. His words spread through radio networks, becoming the unofficial slogan of the campaign. The government paired the military deployment with a civilian mobilization plan called Green Corridors. Villagers who lived near abandoned farms were invited to join cooperatives protected and managed by soldiers. The state provided tools, water pumps, and seeds. In exchange, half of the yield would go directly to local markets. The rest would fill new national reserves. Within 2 months, food convoys began moving from rural provinces back toward Ouagadougou, this time carrying sacks of millet, not foreign aid crates. For Traoré, the deeper logic was strategic resilience. Every previous coup, every rebellion, had been worsened by food shortages. When the grain ran out, loyalty cracked. He intended to seal that fracture. "No army can defend a hungry nation," he told his ministers. and no nation can stay free if it cannot feed its army. His words framed food as a weapon of sovereignty, a doctrine that turned supply chains into defense lines. Satellite data confirmed rapid expansion. New irrigation lines traced across the northern dry belt. Energy reports showed 18% of military fuel redirected toward farming machinery. Local banks opened special harvest bonds to fund equipment purchases. The transformation was measurable, not symbolic. By the end of the first quarter, domestic cereal output had risen 23%. Inflation on imported rice dropped for the first time in 3 years. Yet, outside Africa, skepticism persisted. Analysts at 2 Western think tanks labeled the program state-controlled agriculture under military rule. The International Monetary Fund expressed concern that Burkina's agricultural experiment could undermine private sector participation. But inside the Sahel, neighboring nations were taking notes. Mali sent observers. Niger requested training materials. The idea of an armed agronomy corps began to circulate in regional security meetings. For the soldiers themselves, the experience reshaped identity. Men who once guarded checkpoints now manage irrigation valves and data tablets. The discipline of command translates easily into the rhythm of cultivation. When a commander gives the order to secure the field, it now means protecting seedlings from flood, not insurgents. The language of war merges with the language of renewal. The visual contrast is powerful. Lines of soldiers planting side by side with farmers, tractors replacing armored carriers, the flag of Burkina Faso fluttering above a green horizon instead of dust. To the people watching from nearby villages, it feels like reclaiming not just land, but dignity. For decades they had waited for outside help. Now they see their own sons turning the soil. Still, one question remains whispered in policy circles. Is this transformation purely economic? Or is it preparation for a broader confrontation, a food war that will decide which nations survive the next global supply shock? By the 3rd month of Operation Harvest, Burkina Faso was no longer seen as an experiment. It had become a spectacle. The world began to notice that Traore's army of farmers was producing results that traditional aid programs had failed to deliver in years. Drone footage released by local media showed massive green belts emerging where dry plains once stood. Soldiers who used to patrol border regions were now photographed guiding oxen through irrigation canals. The images went viral across African networks, sparking a wave of pride and disbelief. International news outlets reacted in 2 tones, admiration and alarm. The Financial Times called it a radical blend of militarism and agrarian reform. Le Monde described it as a silent revolution. Washington think tanks, however, warned of authoritarian efficiency, the idea that Burkina's success could embolden other African states to sideline foreign contractors and take food production into their own hands. The real climax arrived when Traore addressed the nation from a field in Sicily province. Dressed in simple fatigues, surrounded by soldiers and villagers, he stood behind a wooden podium built from local timber. "This is the new defense line," he declared. "Not trenches, but terraces. Not bullets, but seeds. And those who underestimate this army will wake up hungry." The crowd erupted. It was a speech that blurred the line between military command and spiritual invocation. Within hours, international headlines exploded. Some called it eco-nationalism, others agrarian militarization. But inside Burkina Faso, the effect was electrifying. Farmers felt seen, soldiers felt proud. Civil servants began volunteering weekends to help with planting. For a nation long defined by scarcity, the sight of abundance grown by its own hands was almost sacred. Foreign reactions came swiftly. France's Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a statement expressing concern over the militarization of agricultural systems. The European Union called for transparency in food distribution and market access. The IMF suspended a planned food security grant, citing structural policy review. But none of that slowed Traore's project. In fact, it seems to harden public resolve. In Wahiguya, a group of youth farmers painted a slogan on a barn wall. They send aid, we send harvest. The phrase spread across radio talk shows and became a national chant. Even the diaspora communities in Paris and Montreal began organizing Green Doctrine fundraisers. For once, Burkina Faso's narrative wasn't one of dependence. It was defiance through productivity. Inside the capital, the shift was visible even at the markets. Prices of imported rice and maize began to stabilize. Local traders displayed new signs: 100% Faso grown. Women in cooperatives sang patriotic songs at dawn. For many, it felt like the spirit of Thomas Sankara had returned, not in speeches, but in shovels and sweat. Not everyone applauded. Opposition figures accused the government of exploiting military labor. Western analysts raised questions about efficiency and cost transparency. Critics warned that soldiers might abandon training standards or neglect defense duties. Yet, as security reports later showed, domestic stability had improved during the operation. Banditry declined in rural zones where military farms operated, partly because soldiers were stationed among the people, not isolated in distant barracks. The tension peaked when a senior European diplomat suggested that Burkina Faso was turning food into a political weapon. Traore responded calmly in an interview. "It is not a weapon. It is a shield." That single phrase, simple, unpolished, spread across African social media like wildfire. It encapsulated his philosophy: sovereignty built not by aggression, but by resilience. For the United States, the development posed a strategic puzzle. Was this the rise of a new African economic model? Self-contained, state-driven, resistant to Western finance? Or was it a temporary populist wave that would fade under pressure? The Pentagon issued no formal comment, but analysts within the State Department quietly noted a shift in African military doctrine, from kinetic warfare to resource defense. And so, while the world debated definitions, Burkina Faso continued to plant. Each passing week deepened the transformation from military outpost to breadbasket. The question was no longer whether the policy worked, but what it meant for the balance of power in West Africa. 5 years. By the 6th month, the results of Operation Harvest were no longer confined to military briefings. They were visible in daily life. Across Burkina Faso's provinces, food queues shortened. Grain depots that had once been empty now overflowed with maize, sorghum, and rice. For the first time in years, the state no longer relied on emergency imports to feed its cities. Markets reopened with stable prices, and the word famine began to fade from radio broadcasts. But the transformation carried deeper civil and political consequences than anyone anticipated. Traore's strategy had quietly rewritten the social contract between government, army, and citizen. In a nation where the military had long symbolized power and distance, it now represented service and humility. Soldiers who once patrolled with rifles now worked shoulder to shoulder with villagers, building trust through labor instead of authority. The change in perception was profound. Mothers in rural areas began calling the soldiers "our sons of the soil." Schools reopened near the new cooperatives, supported by the food surplus generated nearby. Children were fed through military-assisted canteens, often served by the same officers who once guarded checkpoints. In less than half a year, the image of the army, once feared, had become one of solidarity. Politically, the government experienced a surge of legitimacy. Surveys conducted by local media indicated record levels of public trust, over 80% approval in rural provinces. Parliament passed new legislation establishing agro-security zones, areas where military farming units and civilians could co-manage land under joint supervision. Critics called it military socialism, but for most citizens it was simply proof that governance could deliver tangible results. The ripple effects spread across the Sahel. Mali, Niger, and even Chad sent delegations to study Burkina's hybrid model. Economic planners began discussing the possibility of an AES agricultural pact, a regional alliance for food security parallel to their existing defense treaty. The idea was simple but revolutionary. Replace aid dependency with collective cultivation. Inside the country, industries began to respond. Local manufacturers produced irrigation pipes, grain silos, and solar-powered water pumps. Former miners returned from abroad to join cooperatives, bringing technical knowledge. The employment rate in agricultural zones rose by 18%. Banks, sensing opportunity, launched harvest loans for rural entrepreneurs. A quiet industrial ecosystem was forming, not around gold or oil, but around the value of food itself. Still, not every effect was positive. Some private landowners resisted the redistribution of unused acreage to military cooperatives. Accusations of favoritism surfaced, especially where soldiers managed high-yield plots near major highways. Opposition parties argued that the government was using agriculture to extend its political influence. But each scandal faded when new production numbers were published, numbers that showed national food output climbing by double digits. In the capital, the tone of political debate began to shift. Instead of arguing about foreign aid or IMF loans, lawmakers debated irrigation quotas and seed patents. The language of politics became practical, even patriotic. Food became the new symbol of sovereignty. A growing number of youth movements adopted the slogan, "Freedom feeds itself." Traore, for his part, remained publicly silent for several weeks. He appeared only once on state television, standing beside a grain warehouse, thanking citizens for turning defense into abundance. The camera lingered on the flag waving above the silos, a quiet image that said more than any speech could. Outside the Sahel, reactions hardened. Western aid agencies began withdrawing some programs, arguing that military-managed agriculture blurred humanitarian boundaries. France proposed an EU review of state-controlled rural operations. The IMF postponed future credit lines, warning of distortions in private market equilibrium. Yet, as Western funding paused, regional cooperation accelerated. The AES bloc announced the creation of a joint food security reserve, stockpiling cereals across borders to stabilize prices. The social impact went beyond economics. In villages once abandoned by migration, families returned. Roads once too dangerous for travel were now lined with market stalls. Even crime rates dipped. It was as if the act of planting had restored not only food, but faith. In leadership, in work, in nationhood. But beneath this optimism lingered a quiet unease. Analysts warned that success could create expectations too large to sustain. "The danger," one Burkinabe journalist wrote, "is not failure. It is triumph without preparation." Could a nation built on discipline of the army also nurture the freedom of its farmers? Outside Africa, Operation Harvest has become a geopolitical Rorschach test. Each observer sees in it what they fear most. In Washington, policy analysts split into two camps. One group frames it as a populist agricultural gamble, warning that Burkina Faso could fall into economic isolation. The other views it as a potential model of resilience, an early sign that Africa is learning to secure its own future without dependence on aid pipelines. At think tanks and embassy briefings, the same question repeats. Is Traore building farms or fortresses? The U.S. Department of State issued cautious statements emphasizing concern over transparency and human rights. But internal memos obtained by journalists reveal a deeper worry. American strategists now see food sovereignty as a security issue. If African nations learn to feed themselves without Western supply chains, the traditional levers of influence, credit, grain, and aid, begin to lose weight. The Pentagon's Africa Command quietly noted that Burkina's doctrine integrates logistical discipline into production capacity, a model that could reduce external dependence across the Sahel. In Europe, reactions followed economic lines. French and EU agribusiness lobbies protested that militarized farming could distort regional markets and limit private exports. France's media described the policy as the Green Curtain, a barrier against imported food contracts. Meanwhile, Russian commentators praised it as a sovereignty revolution. Chinese state media called it a pragmatic path to self-reliance. Each headline, though different in tone, confirmed the same truth. A small, landlocked nation had forced the world to rethink the meaning of power. At the United Nations, delegates debated whether Operation Harvest violated trade norms or fulfilled the spirit of self-determination. The IMF's temporary freeze on food credit drew backlash from African economists, who argued that the world should not punish a nation for feeding its people. As those words spread, Burkina's story became more than local. It became symbolic. For the global South, Traore's experiment represents defiance through creation. For the global North, it signals a new kind of challenge, one fought not with weapons or sanctions, but with soil and seeds. Either way, the balance of dependence is shifting. The question haunting policymakers is no longer about ideology, but survival. What happens when the poorest nations learn to live without permission? In the quiet rhythm of planting and harvest, Burkina Faso may have uncovered the most subversive form of resistance: self-sufficiency. What began as a desperate reallocation of soldiers has evolved into a national doctrine. The rifle and the hoe now share the same mission: to defend the nation's future. And for the first time in decades, the people of Burkina Faso are not waiting for someone else to save them. They are doing it with their own hands. Yet history warns that success can be fragile. If the next drought arrives early, or if global markets retaliate through tariffs and credit cuts, the pressure on Traore's system could become immense. The same soldiers who now harvest grain may be forced to defend those harvests against new forms of economic warfare. Every seed planted in the soil is also a statement of defiance, a declaration that Africa will no longer outsource its survival. The larger question remains: can this model sustain itself without sliding into over-control or corruption? Can a nation that centralizes power for protection later decentralize it for prosperity? For now, the fields are green, the silos full, and the mood defiant. But revolutions built on discipline must eventually learn balance. Freedom, like food, must be cultivated carefully, or it can spoil. As night falls over Ouagadougou, farmers and soldiers share the same firelight, their hands rough with soil, their eyes lifted toward a horizon that finally feels like their own. The experiment may still fail, but even failure born of courage reshapes destiny more than obedience born of fear. If this story touched your sense of justice, share your thoughts below. If you believe a nation can defend itself through creation, not destruction, press like and stay with us. And if you still believe that Africa's dignity begins with its own harvest, tell us what sovereignty means to you tonight. Because one day soon, the next global crisis may not be about money or oil, but about food. And when that day comes, the world may remember that in a small corner of West Africa, 8,000 soldiers once laid down their weapons and picked up the future.